Welcome to a new episode from English Plus Podcast. I'm your host, Danny, and I'm thrilled to start this new series with you. This new series is called On the Wrong Side of History. Now, before I start telling you about what we're going to discuss in today's episode, let me tell you a little bit about the series itself. History is full of lessons, some triumphant, others tragic. On the Wrong Side of History dives deep into pivotal moments when individuals, nations, or movements found themselves aligned with the wrong course of action, whether by choice, ideology, or miscalculation. These events shaped the world, leaving behind lessons that we, as a global society, must not forget. In this series, we explore infamous decisions, conflicts, and ideologies that led to devastating consequences. From political blunders and misguided wars to cultural upheavals and social injustices, each episode uncovers stories of arrogance, fear, and misjudgment that left an indelible mark on history. But this series is not about shaming or blaming. It's about learning. We seek to remind the world that mistakes are not unique to any one nation or people. History shows that we are all fallible. By examining these critical moments, we aim to inspire reflection, promote understanding, and emphasize the importance of making better choices in the future. Join me as we journey through time, discussing incidents such as the Salem Witch Trials, the Apartheid regime, the Vietnam War, and more. Each episode will take you behind the events, exploring the motives, the consequences, and the human stories caught in the turmoil. Ultimately, On the Wrong Side of History encourages us all to confront the uncomfortable truths of our past, not to dwell in regret, but to ensure that these mistakes are never repeated. So my friends, that was about the series, and I hope you're as excited about it as I am. And now let's shift our focus to today's episode number 1. By the way, this series is going to be 10 episodes. Each episode, we're going to talk about 5 different events. Now let's talk about today's episode. Now, what if I told you history isn't just a story of triumphs, but a collection of moments where humanity found itself on the wrong side of justice, morality, and reason? In today's episode, we dive deep into the dark corners of history with 5 riveting topics from our series On the Wrong Side of History. We'll explore the crumbling of walls, literally, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, dig in the Inquisition to see how faith was weaponized, and travel to Apartheid South Africa to understand what happens when segregation becomes law. But we're not stopping there. Join us for the Salem Witch Trials, a tale of hysteria outpacing reason, and uncover the brutal legacy of colonialism in Africa. Curious yet? Well, stick around, my friends, because these stories are not just relics of the past. They're mirrors to the present, reflecting lessons we still need to learn today. And hey, if you want to unlock this entire episode along with the full back catalog of English Plus, become a premium subscriber on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. You can find the links in the description of the episode. You'll also find a treasure trove of knowledge waiting for you at EnglishPlusPodcast.com, including exclusive audio series available in our brand new shop. I'm your host, Danny, and you're about to embark on a journey through some of history's most uncomfortable truths. Are you ready? Let's dive in. And let's start our episode by talking about the fall of the Berlin Wall. Cold War powers miscalculated. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. Imagine waking up one morning to find that a wall dividing your city, your friends, your family, and your entire way of life had disappeared overnight. What happens when a symbol of oppression and fear, one that stood for nearly 3 decades, suddenly crumbles without warning? The story of the Berlin Wall's fall is not just about bricks and barbed wire tumbling down. It's about the delicate, dangerous game of political chess played by Cold War superpowers, the United States, the Soviet Union, and their allies, who miscalculated the tides of history. What started as a tool for control and division became in the end an emblem of their own strategic failure. But what led to such a monumental misstep? Well, let's take a step back to 1961. The Berlin Wall wasn't just thrown up overnight by accident. It was the Cold War's concrete manifestation, physically dividing East from West, communism from capitalism, and locking in the ideological battle between the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc. On one side, the Soviet-controlled East Berlin. On the other, the free-spirited Western-aligned West Berlin. For nearly 30 years, this brutal barrier stood not just as means to stop East Germans from fleeing to the West, but as a stark reminder of the world's fragility, where one wrong move could ignite a global catastrophe. The truth is, both sides saw this wall as necessary. The Soviets needed to stop the hemorrhaging of East Germans escaping to a life they deemed better in the West. The United States and its allies accepted it as an ugly but stabilizing force in a world teetering on the edge of nuclear war. What no one fully anticipated was the human element, the resilience, hope, and sheer will of the people who lived under its shadow. Now, fast forward to the 1980s, and the Cold War had become something of an unrelenting stalemate. But beneath this icy exterior, things were beginning to thaw. The Soviet Union was crumbling internally, even if its leaders couldn't admit it. Economic strain, growing unrest, and the rise of reformers like Mikhail Gorbachev signaled that change was coming, whether the powers wanted it or not. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring, were designed to save the Soviet system, but instead, they loosened the iron grip that had kept the Eastern Bloc nations in check for so long. Now, here's where the Cold War powers miscalculated. The West, entrenched in decades of cautious diplomacy, didn't see the fall of the wall coming, at least not when it did. The Soviets, caught in their web of internal chaos, couldn't hold the line anymore. And the people? Oh, the people. Those thousands who had been held hostage by this brutal divide, they were hungry for freedom. They were no longer afraid. The night of November the 9th, 1989 wasn't supposed to happen. A bungled press conference in East Germany, followed by miscommunication, led to a flood of people storming the wall. Soldiers stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The borders opened, not because of a calculated decision by the higher-ups, but because the sheer force of human will made it so. The world watched in awe as jubilant crowds scaled the wall, hammered away at it, and embraced long-lost family and friends. It wasn't just a triumph of diplomacy or strategy, it was the triumph of humanity over the cold, hard machinery of political oppression. In the aftermath, world leaders scrambled to make sense of it all. The fall of the Berlin Wall didn't just mark the end of a physical barrier. It was the death knell for the Cold War. The Soviet Union would collapse just 2 years later, and with it, the entire world order that had defined global politics for nearly half a century. But make no mistake, this was not the plan. No master strategist had mapped out this course. The Cold War powers had miscalculated, overestimating their control, underestimating the strength of the human spirit, and failing to foresee that their carefully built world would collapse not with a bang, but with the quiet, determined chisel of everyday people. So what does the fall of the Berlin Wall teach us today? It reminds us that power is fleeting, that no regime, no matter how mighty, can stand forever if it doesn't have the will of the people behind it. But more importantly, it teaches us that when we build walls, whether they are physical, ideological, or emotional, we often trap ourselves on the wrong side of history. As we reflect on that unforgettable night in 1989, the question we must ask ourselves is, are we still building walls today? Whether in our politics, our communities, or even within ourselves, have we learned from the past? Or are we simply repeating the same mistakes, assuming that control and division will lead to peace? Because if the fall of the Berlin Wall teaches us anything, it's that walls don't last. And maybe, just maybe, they're not meant to. Alright, my friends, that was about the fall of the Berlin Wall. Next, we're going to talk about something from a different era, of course. It's about the Inquisition, when faith was weaponized. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. What happens when something as personal and profound as faith is transformed into a weapon of fear, control, and persecution? The Inquisition, a dark chapter in human history, was not born out of the desire for justice or truth, but from the belief that faith could be used as a tool for dominance. This was a time when religious authorities believed they held the power to root out heresy through any means necessary, even if it meant sacrificing the very compassion and understanding that their faith was supposed to represent. The Inquisition wasn't just about rooting out heretics. It was about power, control, and the dangerous intersection of faith and politics. Now, let's step back to the Middle Ages, a time when Europe was deeply religious, but also politically fragmented. Christianity was the dominant force, but as different kingdoms rose and fell, so did their interpretations of faith. What was orthodox in one place might be deemed heretical in another. It was a time of incredible anxiety. If you were labeled a heretic, it didn't just mean your soul was in danger. It could mean your entire life was at risk. This was a time when the church held immense sway over not just the spiritual lives of people, but over their political and social standings as well. Enter the Inquisition, a series of institutions within the Catholic Church charged with protecting the faith by investigating, trying, and punishing those deemed to have strayed from orthodox beliefs. At its heart, the Inquisition believed it was doing good, protecting the souls of believers, defending the church, and ensuring that dangerous ideas didn't spread like wildfire. But the reality was far darker. Fear became the driving force. The mere accusation of heresy could lead to torture, imprisonment, or even execution, often without fair trial or solid evidence. It was faith weaponized against the very people it was meant to guide and protect. The Spanish Inquisition, perhaps the most infamous of these institutions, began in the late 15th century. Initially, it was used as a way to unify Spain under Catholicism after centuries of Muslim and Jewish influence. But it soon spiraled into something far more brutal. Converts from Judaism and Islam, known as conversos and moriscos, were especially targeted, as were those suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. Even a whisper of suspicion could lead to arrest, and the methods used to extract confessions were anything but merciful. It's important to remember, though, that this wasn't some rogue faction operating without oversight. The Inquisition had the full backing of the church, and in the case of the Spanish Inquisition, the monarchy. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella saw the Inquisition as a way to consolidate their power, unify their kingdom under one religion, and eliminate any opposition. It was a brilliant political move, but one that came at the cost of untold human suffering. Why did it work for so long? How did fear and faith become so tightly intertwined that people willingly betrayed neighbors, friends, and even family members? The truth is, it wasn't just about religion. It was about survival. The Inquisition created a culture of fear, where silence could be seen as complicity, and any deviation from the norm was dangerous. People turned on each other, not necessarily out of conviction, but out of fear that they themselves might be the next target. And yet, here's the real irony. The more the Inquisition tried to suppress heresy, the more it fueled resistance. People began to question not just the methods of the Inquisition, but the very foundation of the Church's authority. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation were sown in this era, as individuals like Martin Luther began to challenge the idea that the Church had a monopoly on truth and salvation. In trying to eliminate heresy, the Inquisition ultimately weakened the Church's grip on the people, leading to centuries of religious conflict and reform. So where does that leave us today? The story of the Inquisition serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of zealotry and the weaponization of belief. Faith is meant to be a guiding light, something that brings people together and fosters compassion. But when it's twisted into a tool of control, it becomes a force of destruction. As we look back on this dark period in history, we must ask ourselves, are we still allowing fear to shape our beliefs? Are we using our ideologies, religious or otherwise, to divide rather than unite? Because if history teaches us anything, it's that when we weaponize faith, we find ourselves on the wrong side of history. And that brings us to the question. In today's world, where faith, politics, and fear are all still intertwined, how do we ensure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past? So that was about the Inquisition, my friends. Now let's move on to another topic. We're going to talk about the Apartheid South Africa, when a nation chose segregation. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. What happens when an entire nation decides that the color of your skin determines your worth, your rights, and even where you're allowed to walk, live, or love? The story of apartheid in South Africa is not just about laws and policies. It's about choices. It's about a nation that made a decision to embrace segregation, to build a society where white supremacy was enforced through every aspect of life, and to deny basic human dignity to millions of people for nearly half a century. Like so many tragic chapters in history, this wasn't a story of villains alone. It's a story of human beings, on all sides, caught in a system that thrived on fear, control, and division. Let's wind the clock back to 1948. The world had just come out of World War II, a conflict where racism and hatred had fueled the horrors of the Holocaust. In the aftermath, nations everywhere were grappling with the question of how to rebuild, how to make sure such atrocities never happened again. And yet, in South Africa, a very different decision was made. The National Party, with its platform of apartheid, a system of strict racial segregation, came to power, and with it, the machinery of oppression was set into motion. But where did this idea of apartheid come from? It wasn't an overnight invention. The seeds had been planted long before, in the colonial history of South Africa. When European settlers arrived in the 17th century, they brought with them the same ideas of racial superiority that were prevalent across the world. Over time, these ideas solidified into laws and customs that systematically marginalized the black majority, as well as other non-white groups like the Indian and colored populations. But it was in 1948, under the banner of apartheid, that these ideas were codified into one of the most oppressive systems the world has ever seen. Imagine a world where every part of your life is dictated by your race, where you are told where you can live, who you can marry, which schools you can attend, and even which benches you can sit on. That was life under apartheid. The system wasn't just about segregation, it was about control. Black South Africans were stripped of their citizenship, forced into townships and homelands, their movements restricted by passbooks that functioned as internal passports. Meanwhile, the best resources, land, and opportunities were reserved for the white minority. This wasn't just social discrimination, it was economic exploitation on a massive scale. The economy of South Africa was built on the backs of black labor, but those workers had no share in the wealth they created. They were cheap labor for the mines, the factories, and the farms, essential to the functioning of the country, yet utterly excluded from its prosperity. The government justified the system by claiming that it was separate development, that each race would develop on its own, in its own space. But the reality was clear. Apartheid was about maintaining white dominance at all costs. What's remarkable, though, is the extent to which apartheid was not just accepted, but actively defended by its supporters. There were those who truly believed, that this system was just, that it was necessary to protect the different races from one another. Others were motivated by fear, the fear of losing power, the fear of change, the fear of what might happen if the oppressed majority rose up. And then there were those who simply didn't want to see the truth, who lived their lives in comfortable ignorance, convinced that the system worked because it worked for them. But as with all systems of oppression, cracks began to show. Throughout the 20th century, resistance to apartheid grew, both inside South Africa and on the global stage. Leaders like Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and Steve Biko emerged, risking everything to challenge the regime. They faced imprisonment, exile, and death, but their message was clear. Apartheid could not last. It was morally, socially, and politically unsustainable. And yet, the fall of the apartheid didn't come as quickly as it should have. The system persisted for decades, propped up by international allies who were more interested in Cold War politics or economic gain than in standing up for human rights. But the voices of the oppressed could not be silenced forever. In 1990, after years of struggle, global pressure, and internal unrest, South Africa's government finally began to dismantle apartheid. Nelson Mandela was released from prison after 27 years, and in 1994, South Africa held its first free election with Mandela as its first black president. But the end of the apartheid didn't erase the scars it left behind. The legacy of that system is still felt in South Africa today, in its economy, its politics, and its society. Reconciliation has been slow and painful, and the wounds of segregation, poverty, and inequality run deep. And yet, the fall of apartheid is a statement to the power of human resilience, to the ability of a nation to change, and to the possibility of justice, even after decades of injustice. So what can we learn from apartheid? Perhaps the most important lesson is that fear of the other, fear of change, fear of losing power, can lead us down dangerous paths. When we allow fear to dictate our choices, we risk building systems of oppression that, once in place, are hard to dismantle. But history also shows us that these systems, no matter how entrenched, cannot last forever. The question for us today is, are we still making choices based on fear? And if we are, how can we learn from the past to make sure that we don't find ourselves once again on the wrong side of history? So my friends, that was about the apartheid in South Africa. Next, we're going to talk about the Salem Witch Trials. Hysteria over reason is coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. What happens when fear and superstition take over, leaving logic and reason behind? When suspicion spreads faster than the truth, and people begin to believe the unthinkable. Welcome to Salem, 1692, where hysteria replaced reason and the infamous witch trials began. The Salem Witch Trials are one of the most shocking examples of how quickly a society can spiral into chaos when fear becomes the driving force. In this tiny Puritan village in Massachusetts, something sinister started to creep through the community. It began with a few young girls who claimed to be possessed by an unseen evil. They convulsed, screamed, and accused local women of practicing witchcraft, and the accusations spread like wildfire. But before we dive deeper, let's consider this. Why was Salem, of all places, so vulnerable to such hysteria? The answer lies in a perfect storm of social, political, and religious tension. Salem was a community living on the edge. It was a small, tightly knit village where everyone knew everyone's business. The Puritans who lived there were deeply religious and believed in the literal existence of the devil. They also saw themselves as a people chosen by God, living in a wilderness surrounded by unknown dangers, both spiritual and physical. This was not just a fight for survival, but a battle between good and evil. At the time, the colonies were also dealing with the aftermath of war, disease, and internal strife. The people of Salem were exhausted, anxious, and looking for someone or something to blame for their misfortunes. And in 1692, that something became witchcraft. And the accusations grew. Fear overtook reason. Neighbor turned on neighbor. Children accused their parents. Husbands accused their wives. The trials escalated to such a frenzy that it seemed no one was safe from the shadow of suspicion. And here's where things get really interesting, because the accusations weren't about witchcraft alone. Beneath the surface, there were old grudges, land disputes, and power struggles at play. In a society where men held most of the power, women, especially those who didn't fit the mold of the perfect Puritan women, were easy targets. Some of the accused were outspoken, others were healers or midwives, and still others were simply women who didn't conform to society's strict expectations. They were different, and in times of fear, difference often becomes dangerous. The trials were a far cry from justice. Evidence was flimsy at best, relying on spectral evidence. The supposed visions of the afflicted girls, claiming to see the spirits of witches tormenting them. People confessed under the threat of torture or execution, and those who refused to confess were hanged. Over the course of a few months, 20 people were executed, most of them women, and many more were imprisoned. But how did it come to this? Why did so many, from villagers to judges, abandon logic and embrace fear? Part of the answer lies in the power of collective hysteria. When enough people start believing in something, even something as outlandish as witchcraft, it gains momentum. People become swept up in the frenzy, afraid to speak out lest they become the next target. However, like all fires fueled by fear, the hysteria eventually burned itself out. By early 1693, the trials were halted and many of the remaining accused were released from prison. The aftermath was devastating. Families were left shattered, reputations ruined, and the community of Salem was forever scarred by the events. In the years that followed, people began to realize the terrible mistake they had made. Judges and ministers publicly apologized, and reparations were made to the families of those who had been wrongly accused. But even today, the Salem Witch Trials remain a haunting reminder of what happens when fear takes over. It shows how easily a community can be torn apart when reason is cast aside in favor of suspicion and superstition. It's a tale as old as time. Fear of the unknown, fear of the different, fear of losing control. And it continues to play out in different forms throughout history. As we reflect on the events of Salem, we must ask ourselves, are we any different today? Do we still allow fear to guide our decisions, whether it's in politics, society, or even our personal lives? How often do we let suspicion take over, jumping to conclusions before seeking the truth? And that's where I'll leave you with today's question. In an age of instant information and snap judgments, how do we ensure that we aren't letting our own fears cloud our reason? And how do we stop ourselves from becoming the next Salem? Well, think about that, my friends. But now it's time to move on to the last topic for today's episode, but not the last topic for the series. Remember, the series, as I told you, is 10 episodes, and within each episode, we have 5 topics just like these we talked about today. But let's continue our last topic for today. We're going to talk about colonialism in Africa, the scramble for exploitation. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. What happens when entire continents are seen as nothing more than maps to be carved up, divided, and conquered for wealth and power? The story of colonialism in Africa is one of the most striking examples of how greed and exploitation can shape and scar a land and its people. Known as the Scramble for Africa, this period of history saw European powers competing to slice up the African continent for their own benefit, with little regard for the millions of people who called it home. But this was more than just a land grab. It was a calculated effort to extract every resource, every ounce of wealth from a region that, in the eyes of those power, existed solely to serve their imperial ambitions. Let's rewind to the late 19th century. Europe was buzzing with technological advancements, industrialization, and a sense of national pride that had begun to morph into full-blown nationalism. But as countries like Britain, France, Belgium, and Germany became wealthier, they needed more. More resources, more markets, more land to assert their dominance. And Africa, vast and rich in untapped resources, was the perfect target. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 is often considered the starting point of this mad dash. Picture this. European leaders, none of whom had ever set foot in Africa, gathered around a table, slicing the continent into territories as they were dividing a cake at a birthday party. The people living on those lands were never consulted, of course. Why would they be? In the eyes of the colonizers, the people of Africa were not seen as equals. Instead, they were viewed as subjects to be ruled over, labor to be exploited, and obstacles to be overcome in the pursuit of wealth. What followed was a brutal chapter in history. Countries like Belgium under King Leopold II treated African land and people as personal property. In the Congo, millions were forced into labor, working under horrific conditions to harvest rubber, ivory, and other resources. Those who refused or who didn't meet their quotas were mutilated or killed. Meanwhile, other colonial powers like Britain and France imposed their own harsh systems of governance and exploitation, extracting minerals, agricultural products, and wealth from the land while subjugating and dehumanizing its people. But this was not just about economic exploitation. Colonialism also tore apart Africa's social fabric. Borders were drawn without any regard for the existing cultures, languages, or ethnic groups, setting the stage for decades of conflict. Traditional systems of governance were replaced with foreign rule, and the cultural identities of African societies were systematically suppressed, often under the guise of bringing civilization to the so-called uncivilized. And here's the irony. The very empires that preached the virtues of civilization, progress, and human advancement were committing some of the worst atrocities in human history. They justified their actions with a mix of racist ideologies, claiming that Africans were inferior and incapable of governing themselves. This was the heart of colonialism, greed wrapped in the language of superiority. But what about the people themselves? What happens when you strip a population of its land, its freedom, and its identity? Resistance, of course. Across the continent, from the Ashanti Kingdom in West Africa to the Zulu in the south, people fought back. Some revolts were brutally suppressed, while others simmered for decades, eventually culminating in the independence movements of the 20th century. But by then, the damage was done. Colonization had left deep scars, many of which are still visible today. The legacy of colonialism didn't just disappear when European powers packed their bags and left. The arbitrary borders they created, the systems of governance they imposed, and the economic structures they built remained, often leaving newly independent African nations in a state of political and economic turmoil. Countries that had been exploited for their resources were left with economies reliant on exporting raw materials, while the wealth generated during colonial times remained in European hands. Colonialism was not just a historical event. It shaped the modern world in ways that continue to impact global politics, economics, and social relations. Many of the conflicts and struggles for power that we see in Africa today can be traced back to the colonial period. And while some might argue that the colonizers brought modern infrastructure, education, and technology, it's crucial to remember that these benefits were often introduced for the sole purpose of furthering exploitation, not for the betterment of the people. As we reflect on the scramble for Africa, we have to ask ourselves, how do we reckon with this history? How do we acknowledge the wrongs without dwelling in the past? Because if there's one lesson to be learned from colonialism, it's that exploitation, whether of people, land, or resources, never leads to true progress. The question we face today is, in a world still shaped by the legacies of colonialism, how can we ensure that we are not repeating the same patterns of exploitation and domination, whether on a global scale or in our own communities? These are all important questions you have to ask yourselves, my friends. Again, I told you from the very first beginning of this series is not meant to blame anybody. It's not blamed to point fingers and say that it's your fault, it's my fault, etc. It's everybody's fault. The people who did it, the people who saw who did it and didn't say anything, the people who took a piece of the action in return of their silence, and for us today to turn a blind eye to all this history and never want to learn anything from it. That's the true message, the true purpose of On the Wrong Side of History series. Again, we're not trying to blame anybody, because if we go down this road, we are all to blame. As nations, we all made our unforgivable mistakes. But we need to get past that. We need to move on to a better place, to learn from these mistakes, to never let them happen again. That's the whole purpose behind On the Wrong Side of History series. Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, my friends. We've covered walls that crumbled, faith that faltered, systems that segregated, fears that spiraled into chaos, and a continent scarred by greed. But remember, history isn't just about what's been, it's about what could be. The big question now is, are we still building walls, exploiting fears, or repeating the patterns of the past? Well, if you enjoyed this episode, don't stop here. There's so much more waiting for you. Unlock the full back catalog by becoming a premium subscriber on Apple Podcasts or Patreon. You can find the links in the description of the episode. Don't forget to visit us at EnglishPlusPodcast.com, where you'll find bonus content, in-depth articles, and brand new audio series in the shop. Keep learning, keep questioning, and most importantly, stay curious. This is your host, Danny. I'll see you in the next episode of English Plus Podcast. Until then, let's make sure we end up on the right side of history.